couldn't see all of you, and I thought there was more of you. You know, you did a great job. It's raining, it's cold, there's a guest preacher, and the Cowboys are on at noon. It's good of you to be here. Thank you for being a great church for my family. David, thank you for being their pastor. And thank you for your kind invitation to preach. Most of us are daily on the internet, or we read a newspaper, or we watch the TV news, or listen to the radio. And daily we are reminded that there is some kind of crisis going on. Sometimes several crises at the same time. We are not hermits. We live in a world of reality that are sometimes unpleasant. I'd like to lift up two of those current crises. One is, in a land of plenty, there is a decline of real wages for about 60% of the wage earners in this country. There's something that's growing that's called income inequality. And sometime in their lifetime, about half of the people in this country will live in poverty. Young people are suffering from an issue of low wages, and they have a lot of student loans, and their social mobility is limited. Another crisis that we have, it's kind of a hidden one, and that is hunger, and I know that this church does things to address that issue. But about 20% of the people in Louisiana live with what's called food insecurity. That is, they're not real sure where the next couple of meals are going to be coming from. Well, I know that a lot of us would say, well, that's not me. I mean, I got a pension. But these things affect a lot of folks. They affect this church, and they will more so in the future. But I grew up with this middle-class work ethic of, you save and you prepare and you're self-reliant. You don't need to depend on anybody else. So for me, that means that if I have one tool that works well, I better have two because one might break. My wife was chagrined to learn that I had 8 different drills in the workshop. And 5 guitars, although I can only play one at once. We have in our lives often spare rooms. Some of us even have spare cars. We always have spare change. In a day of crisis, when we are people who have options, why don't we take a look at our mentor, Jesus, and see how he lived in a time of crisis? It's often said when the time was right that Jesus was born. Well, it was a terrible time. His upbringing was dangerous. It was in poverty. And it was a time of crisis, I'm sure, continually. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find a lot of information. Jesus had a baptismal experience. He was an adult. Apparently, he was able to do a lot of traveling and be away from his family. And after his baptism, there was a sense of call to a new life. And that life was met with a lot of success. There was many people who he encountered who found his words to be life-giving. And they followed him around. So much so that sometimes they pressed on him and he didn't have a moment to himself. Then, according to the story that we find in Matthew, Jesus went to his home. his hometown. And it said that he began to teach people in the synagogue, and they were astounded. But they said, where did this man get this wisdom and these deeds of power? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is his mother not called Mary? And are not his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and his sisters, they're with us? Where did this man get all of this? They said, and they took offense at him. And Jesus said, prophets are not without honor except in their own country and their own house. And he did no deeds of power there because of their unbelief. That was a stinging experience for him. He grew up as far as we know, in this one small town. He worked there, and he knew everyone. And then as an adult, a person who has a new call from God and is building up a great reputation, he goes home and it's like, we don't care. That must have really hurt. And then right after that, Jesus had a cousin whose name was John, John the Baptist. And John the Baptist had said some critical things about Herod, the ruler of the country. And Herod had pretty much absolute power to do what he wanted. So he had John in prison, and later he had him killed. And Jesus had just heard about this, and he was obviously distressed, and it said when he heard, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So how is our mentor doing? He must have been a little shaken up and a little discouraged and concerned, what's John's death going to do in terms of my ministry? But a crowd came, and they followed him, it said, and he had compassion for them, and he cured the sick. And then it was evening, and the disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place. The hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. And Jesus said, with all this impressing on him, he said, you need not send them away. You give them something to eat. Well, the disciples then took a little survey of the crowd, and the results were kind of pathetic. All we have are 5 loaves and 2 fish. And there's thousands of people. How can we give them something to eat from this? And then Jesus says these wonderful words, talking about the loaves and fish. You bring them here to me. And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And it said there were about 5,000 men there, and women and children. What, as followers of Jesus, might we think of that we could bring to him that he might be able to multiply? Fish and bread to deal with the hunger in this country and in this community. the wine of celebration that we might appreciate all the gifts that we have been given by God in our lives, money to do the things that only money can do, to take care of others, to be responsible, time to share our interest in loving the needy and the desolate and the lonely, knowledge that we might get away from the sound bites of our news and understand the depth of human existence. Concern for children, that every child is treasured and protected. Health care, that everyone has an opportunity to receive the health care they need. Compassion for the prisoner. Safe housing for everyone. Courage. A resolve to speak truth to power. Could these things not be multiplied if we brought them to Jesus for His blessings? Could we do that even if we just have a little? It comes to mind that we talk maybe more times about Jesus, about who Jesus was rather than what He said. We just got through the season of Advent and Christmas, and that was all about getting ready. And then there was a baby, and then there was a travel of the family and the wise men, and now we move on. But babies do not speak. We didn't have a chance to hear words from Jesus. It was all about Jesus. And then we move on in the Christian year. We come to the next huge holiday, and that's Easter. And that's all about Jesus. And if you were to write down some things that Jesus said, as opposed to a column of what He did and who He was, could you think of some things? I mean, what exactly were the words of Jesus? Wouldn't it be important to have a lot of those embedded in our minds? But you know, some of Jesus' words are pretty hard. He talked a lot about money, maybe more than about anything else. And He talked about concern for the poor. And these words keep coming back to me as I think of what are the words that I want to remember that Jesus said. And how would our mentor deal with the whole idea of church? He lived before Christianity. There was no church as we think about church until after Jesus' death. Might have some insights, though, in our scripture. Do you remember the list of brothers that were named in Jesus' hometown? One was named James. We assume he is the oldest. And there was a James who became a leader in the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. And we hear about him through some of the letters and some of the accounts of the church up until about 66 or so in the Christian era, when there was a Jewish revolt and a lot of people died and all. There was a chance to maybe hear some glimpses of what Jesus might have said to the church through James, his brother. I mean, they grew up in the same house, in the same town. They had the same parents that looked out for them. They must have talked a lot. Now, James was not a disciple, but he became a leader in the church. So you think that the brother might have some words to say that would reflect the thanking of Jesus. We have a book in the New Testament called James. It's written after his death, but it's a tribute to him, and I think maybe a lot of what we find in it would be consistent with his thinking. And you probably know this book. You're going to know some of these sayings. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Or, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, as it has no works, is dead. Or anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, commits sin. Might these be words that are consistent with the thinking of Jesus, that he might speak to the church, to keep reminding us that we have a responsibility to take care of the widows and orphans, the poor, the hungry? These are folks that need to be in our congregation that we're caring from. I don't know how you feel about those words, but they make me uncomfortable. You know, I feel uncomfortable when I know I'm wrong, and I feel uncomfortable when I see human need, and I'm not doing anything at all to try to address it. I have a theory that the day that we have in question, Jesus is having a bit of a crisis, and all these people have come to hear him, to be healed, to find newness of life in him, that a lot of them just came, they didn't think about anything else but Jesus. I want to be in Jesus' presence. And they didn't prepare. But I think a lot of those people did prepare for a journey. And I think that they brought with them some provisions. Maybe some bread and some smoked fish. And when the disciples went through the crowd, they were reluctant. Because they had brought enough, they thought, just to take care of themselves or their families. And they didn't want to share because they wouldn't have enough for themselves. So out in the crowd were lots of loaves and fishes. That's my theory. And I ask you this question. Which would be the bigger miracle? For Jesus to take loaves and fish and somehow multiply them so there was enough to feed everyone and baskets left over? Or would it be a bigger miracle to get his followers to share? Let us pray. Jesus, we say that we love you, and we say we know you. May our lives live out those truths. May you give us the power to share of the gifts